A young woman was found dead in her own home, and the investigation of this case dragged on for several decades. Despite the fact that the police had a DNA sample of the killer, they had to wait for 40 years before technology would allow them to find the culprit. The truth came out only in 2021 year, and a can of Coca-Cola helped the police in this. Sylvia May Seal was born on September 23, 1946, in Denver, Colorado. Soon she had a younger sister named Jo. The family lived in a quiet suburban area of Cherry Hills. Sylvia was ambitious, funny and friendly. She had a lot of friends, and they all called her the soul of the company. From an early age, the girl became interested in architecture, inspired by the works of her uncle, who worked in this direction. Besides, she was a very creative person. She liked to sculpt from clay and cook. After graduating from high school and university, Sylvia got a job as a secretary at a local architectural firm. Thanks to her culinary skills, she also opened a small business and baked wedding cakes to order. Sylvia continued to maintain a very close and trusting relationship with her family. She rented a place just 45 meters from her parents and tried to see them every day. Very often she came to them to have breakfast before leaving for work. On the evening of the 3rd of August, 1981, Sylvia, who was 35 years old at the time, talked to her younger sister on the phone. She arranged to meet the next morning, and at about 11 o'clock Sylvia went to bed. The next day, at about 8 in the morning, her father picked her up to go for coffee together. However, no one responded to the knock on the door, so the man thought that his daughter was still sleeping. Then he went into the house, where a heartbreaking sight awaited him. Sylvia was lying on the floor in the living room. She had absolutely no clothes on, and her hands were folded over her head. There was a lot of blood all over the room, and the body itself was disfigured. The man pulled himself together with difficulty and called the police. Before they arrived, he covered Sylvia with a towel. The police officers who arrived at the crime scene examined the house and made several important discoveries. First, the telephone cable in the living room was cut off. The outside of the wire was also damaged. The criminal threw a garden hose on him and cut him off with a sharp jerk down. All this indicated that the unknown killer had made sure in advance that the victim could not call the police. Secondly, the killer tried to enter Sylvia's house through several windows. Detectives found a small hole on the mesh stretched on the window in the girl's bedroom. This indicated that the criminal initially tried to get into the house from there, but for some reason could not. Then he turned his attention to the bathroom window. The net on it was removed and thrown into the bushes more than 15 meters from the house. Traces of forced entry were found on the wooden window frame. Detectives also found that the window itself was initially locked. This was easily explained by the weather conditions. Unbearable heat reigned all the days, and people had to leave their windows open in order to somehow escape from it. In total, about 140 different clues were found at the crime scene, but in those years criminology did not yet have the necessary tools for their detailed study. After talking to Sylvia's relatives, the police established an approximate time frame for the murder. It happened in the interval between the conversation with my sister at 11 in the evening and the moment when her father stopped by at 8 in the morning. After examining Sylvia's body, medical experts made a number of important discoveries. The woman received several bullets from a .22 caliber weapon, as well as several blows with a sharp object. Criminologists have established that the criminal used a knife from Sylvia's kitchen. In addition, he is highly likely to have subjected her to violence. Experts also came to the conclusion that before her death, the woman tried to fight back against the criminal. This was evidenced by several broken nails. Unfortunately, all these clues did not bring the police any closer to catching the criminal. In those years, experts simply did not have the necessary tools to get at least some leads on the available evidence. The police also failed to find any witnesses who could have noticed the killer that night. Because of this, there has been absolutely no progress in the case for 2 years. In 1983, forensic experts decided to re-examine the evidence from the crime scene using a new laser technology developed by Canadian scientists. It also existed at the time of Sylvia's murder, but at that time the necessary equipment was only in a Canadian laboratory, and its use cost a lot of money. But in the 83rd year, portable and cheaper lasers began to appear, which allowed experts to take a second look at the available evidence. And it has borne fruit. On the carpet that was lying in Sylvia's living room, foreign traces of biological material were found, which most likely belonged to the criminal. However, science was still far from knowing the identity of the killer from these data. In the same year, the famous serial killer and robber Otis Elwood Toole confessed that he had killed Sylvia. At first, the girl's police relatives hoped that this case would finally be solved, but his statement was quickly questioned. He was confused in his testimony and could not name any significant details about this crime. In addition, in total, Toole confessed to 125 murders, of which only 6 were finally proved, so his words were not given much importance. Since then, the case has been frozen for 12 years, until it was decided to reconsider it in 1995. At that moment, criminology took a big step forward. The researchers hoped to get more data on that sample of biological material from the carpet. He was sent to the FBI laboratory, but even they could not extract the DNA profile in a short time. It took a long 5 years until the long-awaited breakthrough finally happened. In the 2000th year, the police had a DNA sample of the killer on their hands. It was entered into the FBI database, but there were no matches. This meant that the criminal had not previously been brought to justice for serious crimes, or it happened before the mandatory collection of DNA from the defendants. At this point, the matter came to a standstill again. The police could only hope that Sylvia's killer would be caught in some other crime, and his DNA would be entered into the database. There were no other ways to establish his identity in those years. But progress did not stand still. In 2000, almost 20 years after the DNA sample was extracted, a non-profit organization called the Denver Crime Fighters teamed up with a genetic genealogy company led by a former district attorney. Together they were engaged in unsolved cases, which the police had a DNA sample of the killers on hand, but it was not possible to establish their identity. The organization was looking for matches on genetic databases, looking for relatives of the owners of DNA. The conducted companies and research have helped to solve many cases that were considered hopeless for decades. In January 2020th year, detectives from the Unsolved Cases Division of Cherry Hills turned to this organization for help, providing them with a DNA sample of Sylvia's killer. They started searching using 2 public DNA databases. They were mainly used to search for relatives and recreate the family tree. People all over the world could upload their DNA samples there to find lost or even unknown members of their family. In the case of Sylvia's killer, the specialists had to do the same. And here they were waiting for one problem: there were more than 3,000 relatives of this person in the databases. The experts had to do a huge amount of work to get to the right name. They began to search for any information on these people, gradually weeding out the most distant relatives and those who at that time could not commit the murder of Sylvia due to age. Only after 4 months of work did they finally have only one name left: David Dwayne Anderson. Investigators found out that at the time of Sylvia's murder, he was 22 years old. He lived near her house in Inglewood. Detectives determined that he had moved to a small town called Ozette, Nebraska, but at that time he could not be arrested on murder charges. This required stronger evidence, such as a direct match of his DNA with a sample found at the scene of Sylvia's murder. On the 18th of January, 2021, detectives went to his house and began to watch him. After waiting for David to go outside to throw out the garbage, one of the police officers removed these 2 garbage bags from the container and handed their contents to the laboratory. There were 15 items in the bags that could help detectives get a sample of David's DNA. Among them was a can of Coca-Cola, as well as a bottle of drinking water, spicy rum and beer. After almost 2 weeks, experts were finally able to extract a DNA sample from a can of Coca-Cola. It was immediately compared with the sample found at the scene of Sylvia's murder, and received a complete match. 40 years later, the police finally had the name of the culprit. He was arrested on February 10 and charged with murder. At that time, the man was already 62 years old. This was announced at a major press conference, during which investigators expressed condolences to Sylvia's relatives. The head of the Cherry Hills Police Department, Michelle Tavria, also spoke there. She told the audience what kind of person Sylvia was and prepared slides with her photos in addition to the story. Unfortunately, Sylvia's parents did not live to see the moment when the name of the killer finally became known. Her father died in '99, and her mother died 10 years later. However, the investigators notified her younger sister, and she took part in the lawsuit against David. After studying his biography, detectives found out that Anderson participated in at least 8 robberies from 1981 to 1986. He fell into the hands of the police, but did not receive any serious punishment. Based on this, the investigation put forward 2 versions of what happened. Either Sylvia's murder was premeditated and pre-planned, or David wanted to rob her house, but ran into a woman and a fight ensued between them. He himself refused to admit his guilt, so the case was referred to the court. If Anderson is convicted of murder, he will be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 20 years. That was state law in 1981, at the time of Sylvia's murder. Now, criminals who are in prison for murder are not eligible for parole. Anderson was supposed to be incarcerated in Dawson County, Nebraska, but he refused extradition and was incarcerated in Colorado. It was originally planned that the trial would end on the 8th of March, 2022 year. However, as it often happens, the process was delayed. The next meeting is scheduled for the 27th of June, but at the moment there is practically no doubt that the man will be found guilty. We will keep you up to date, but in the meantime, do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel, where updates on this case will also be published. Share your opinion on this case in the comments and don't forget to like it if you liked the video. Also, if you have a desire to support the channel financially, you can do it by following the link in the description of this video. As you already know, YouTube has completely removed advertising from the Russian language segment, but we continue to release videos in the same volume, no matter what. Thanks for watching.